Good afternoon and welcome to GrainTV. It's February 15th, 2013. I'm Logan Burgess. To my right here is Cody Bills. Well, Cody, let's jump into Fire Tip. See how the grains traded on a Friday afternoon. As you can see, we saw corn picking up some steam here, finally closing up 3 cents on the March contract. We had soybeans moving higher as well, up 7 3/4 there for the March delivery. And Chicago wheat, the leader to the upside today, up 10 3/4 there. If you guys want to get live quotes over at your home or office, visit us over at grainhedge.com. You can take a no-obligation demo, the platform that you see here. But Cody, can you kind of break down the action that we saw today? Certainly, anybody that's bullish this corn market, excited to see a little bit of a move higher here for the corn market.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in the overnight session, we really pushed higher here. We mostly printed the highs in the overnight session because as soon as the pit opened, we really started to come back. We traded off for the better part of the day from those highs. Near the close, we really did see some volume come back into the market. We saw corn rally back up to around $7. We saw soybeans kind of come back to the higher side of the range that it's been trading at throughout the day. But the bottom line here is it really wasn't very strong. The only one that had strength was wheat, and that really has to do with the export sales that we had yesterday, much stronger than they anticipated, and also just the parched conditions in the Midwest. We are getting a little bit of moisture, but it's just not going to be enough to really do any significant turnaround on the conditions of this crop.
All right, Cody. You know, somebody that kind of watched this trade closely today, what kind of goes through your mind when you see action like this? Do you have any outlook for early next week, what we might see on the heels of today's action?
Yeah, I was a little bit concerned because, you know, after 10 days of selling for corn, you know, and we had these kind of long wicks, which means that we traded down and came back up. We traded down again a second day in a row, and then we were able to kind of move back to the higher side of the range. You know, when you see that sort of price action, usually you think, well, there's some pretty good support down there. But we weren't able to close above $7. And even after 10 days of selling, you know, you'd think we'd have some short positions that people would want to shore up. You know, they'd want to kind of cover some of those short positions going into a long weekend. And even with that sort of short covering possibilities, we didn't get over $7. We weren't able to close over $7. Quite frankly, I think that does not bode well for the future of corn. Maybe we trade up a little bit higher, but I really don't think we have a lot of legs. I think there's a good chance we could go down around that 680 like you'd been talking about for quite some time now.
Yeah, Cody, you know, in today's action, we did have the NOPA numbers out early today. Fundamentally, that was kind of the big news that we saw today. Those numbers did come out a little bit lighter than was expected in general, but in line with trade expectations. One big thing that did catch our eye this morning in terms of soybeans, we did have some cancellations this morning to unknown destinations for 250,000 metric tons. Certainly a lot of guesses are that is to China, is the general consensus when we see that kind of information, but certainly not good for the fundamentals in this bean market. Certainly seemed like it was holding things back a little bit. You know, Cody, as we did mention, Chicago wheat was the big winner to the upside today. Can you kind of break down what the outlook is for moisture here in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, what we do know is that there's been incredibly dry not growing conditions, but incredibly dry conditions going into the growing season across the southern plains here in the HRW growing regions. What we do know is that there is a storm that's going to be moving in and should provide Nebraska with some moisture. They're talking that this storm will happen between the 20th and the 22nd of February and could drop from 8 to 12 inches of snow. What that equivalent is in terms of liquid water here is about 0.75 to an inch of water, and that's just not going to be enough to turn this thing around. So unfortunately, I do still see a moisture concern, even though we do get a little precipitation in the forecast in the coming week.
Right, certainly. You know, I think kind of on the heels of that, we did see some interesting developments out of the cash market today. Certainly, you know, we chart basis very closely here at GrainHedge. Can you kind of break down for us? I think the thing that people are really looking at closely was some of the appreciation that we've seen in the ethanol sector. I know earlier this week we talked about how crush margins are improving. They're now around $1.38 per bushel for ethanol plants. But in general, kind of what are we seeing right now? What's the composition of the cash market?
Well, you know, it's good that you mentioned that, because what we're seeing in the soybeans, really, we did see actually some decreases along the river, about 2-cent decreases in basis along the river. On average, the U.S. soybean cash market basis has decreased by 1 cent in this last week. So we really haven't seen any sort of strength in soybeans at all. Where we saw strength this week was in corn, and particularly in the ethanol sector. Ethanol plants were up between 5 to 10 cents in terms of basis, and that really really comes on the heels of the fact that we saw 76-cent margins for ethanol plants on January 18th. Now we're seeing about $1.38. So we are seeing improved margins. Right. That means that they can afford to bump that basis up. They can afford to draw some of that grain out of the farmers' bins, and that's what they're doing this week. We're just seeing, I guess, a strength in basis across the U.S. We were up on average 1 penny across the U.S. Across all sections, but really ethanol is what stood out.
Yeah, right. You know, Cody, I was digging into the numbers a little bit here this morning, and it does look like just the data in the later part of this week, which we actually haven't reported on yet, it looks like these margins are going to continue to strengthen into early next week. So the expectation is for production to continue to pick up here. Certainly what that means to the farmer out there, if you're out in the Western grain belt, there could be some good basis marketing opportunities right now in your backyard. So if you have questions about that, it might be a good time to give us a ring, kind of see what our take is. As I said, we do have a lot of data on the cash market here. But, you know, in general, Cody, I think that's kind of the action that we saw today on a Friday here in the grain market. Certainly thank us a lot for joining us here on GrainTV, guys. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Monday.